Hi everybody, Alan Robson with you. Great to see you. Hope you're well. Got to tell you about the podcast this week. Oh, how I got to town. First of all, Donald Trump. We're going to have a wade into his territory. What are the worst and most incredulous things that Donald Trump has said? I've picked my best half a dozen. You'll never believe it, even though you probably heard it at the time. We move from that into the world of the goriest and most bloody ways to die. I've given you pretty much a top 20 of those. What was the worst? You're going to have to judge that for yourself. Doesn't stop there. Then I'm taking you up to Scotland, where there is absolute proof that human life existed 2,500 years before the Christian Messiah. There's an alien story attached to that. It's incredible. Don't miss it. Move beyond that, we go to Ireland in an incredible story where everybody who takes over the castle becomes a murderer or a mass murderer. And we're going to finish off in style, something that I have a fair bit of experience over, Honeymoons. I'm going to give you my top 10 worst ever honeymoons and why. Incredible tales, all grisly, for you on Alan Robson's Grisly Tales podcast. Hope you enjoy it. It's a corker this week.
Welcome everybody to another one of Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. Okay, let's have a look at what we're doing tonight. Now, before we started, I know we do grisly things, but I just want to talk to you a little bit about someone who's, on leaving the White House, remains a grisly individual, mainly because every single thing he says and has said in the past is a lie, and yet 40% of the American public still think he's amazing. Donald Trump. Now, yes, we all heard, I will build a wall within the next 12 months. It never happened. He didn't get close to building a wall. He didn't even build a fence. There already was a fence, and it's the same fence that's still there. He was going to put America back to work. Now, over 28 million people are likely to have lost their jobs because of the lousy way he's handling the whole COVID crisis. He said he was going to return the old trades to towns. Car plants that closed down will reopen. None did. Mining would continue again. 3 pits opened, 2 of them have subsequently closed, and the third one is in administration. When he was talking about building the mines, he said that the mines were going to be built to dig out clean coal. He'd heard the phrase, clean coal. And when a reporter asked him how the coal would be clean, because when you burn coal, smoke goes into the air, therefore it's not clean. It's not clean in an ecological way. Donald Trump simply said, they dig it out, they wash it, it's clean coal. Now, that would be funny if it wasn't said by the most powerful man in the world at that time. Also, he said, congratulations to you if you live near a windmill, because the price of your property has gone down £75,000, which actually isn't true. But he was going through a litigation because somebody built a windmill near one of his golf courses. He said also, to make it worse, if you live near a wind turbine, you'll get cancer because of the noise. He says the noise that the windmill makes gives you cancer. Not the wind from it, because there isn't any. The noise gives you cancer, which is patently untrue. He also, of course, did that put it disinfectant in your body thing, because he didn't have any idea what he was talking about. My 2 favourites I'm going to leave you with, and then we can put Trump to bed once and for all and hope he just doesn't bounce back. My second favourite was, he went on board an aircraft carrier and he talked to aviators. And he said, you're flying some of the most sophisticated planes in the world, stealth jets. They're invisible. You will always win any battle with a stealth fighter because they're invisible. The enemy can fly right up beside them and they can't see them because they're invisible. Now, the aviators behind him almost died laughing. You could see in their faces them contorted and trying hard not to laugh in front of their commander-in-chief. A stealth jet is invisible to radar. Everybody else can see it. It's not invisible. It never was invisible. That's Wonder Woman's plane, and that's just in a comic. But my all-time favourite, Donald Trump, having a speech. And you can trace this speech if you want to dig it out. He was giving a speech about Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and the wars therein. And he said, way back in 1776, these brave people climbed over the ramparts of their castles and they went and they secured the airport. They secured the airport in 1776. Really? Unbelievable. And yet people still think the sun shines from his very strange orifice. Unbelievable. Anyway, let us press on. If we find any more Trumpisms, and I've got no doubt thousands more will pour out, but let's get to even more Grisly. It's the Grisly that you seem to enjoy. You wacko. Right, I'm going to tell you about some of the most gory ways to die, grisly ways to lose your life. Now, most of you have probably heard of a very, very brave explorer called Robert Falcon Scott. And he battled to try and get to the Antarctic before anybody else in 1912. And one of his men, Captain Lawrence Edward Grace, Titus Oates he was known as, his surname was Oates, Titus Oates, he died during that mission called the Terra Nova mission. He had awful gangrene and frostbite in his feet and his fingers. He knew he was slowing everybody down, and because he was slowing everybody down, there was a distinct possibility that the entire expedition would lose their lives. So one night, when they were in a tent, according to Robert F. Scott in his journal, Oates opened the tent to the freezing Antarctic outside. And he said, "I'm just going outside and I may be some time." And he would have died of exposure, which is not some quick way to go. It's a slow and horrific way to go if you're in the kind of temperatures that he was. That is one of the grisliest ways to lose your life. So what about a guy called Mikhail Panikaka? Yeah, this was a guy who was a soldier, and he was fighting with the Russians. When I say with the Russians, he was on their side, and he was fighting in World War II at the very famous Battle of Stalingrad, which was a bloody awful fight. He found himself out of anti-tank grenades, and he was just about to be buried alive under dozens and dozens and dozens of German tanks heading towards him. So Panikaka grabbed a pair of Molotov cocktails, kind of handmade bombs. He leapt out of the trench and he tried to light the first Molotov cocktail. But before he could, a bullet from the tank machine gun burst the bottle open, causing flaming petrol to spread all over him. Now, despite being on fire from head to toe, he picked up the other Molotov cocktail, jumped on top of one of the tanks, smashing the bottle on the engine compartment. The tank, along with poor Panikaka, exploded immediately, and the Germans, on seeing their lead tank destroyed, retreated, worried that more Russians would be suicidal and put themselves to death whilst killing German tanks. Now, we're always watching films on the telly about the mafia, and it really is quite a thing even to this day in various parts of the world. Well, Dominic Napolitano, his nickname was Sonny Black. He was a mobster, and he became close with an FBI informant called Joe Pistone. Now, once it was found out that his mate, Pistone, was working for the FBI, and Sonny Black didn't know anything about it, Sonny knew that he would be killed, even though he didn't have any idea that this guy was double-crossing the mafia. So instead of leaving town or becoming a rat and going into like the protective custody of the police, Sonny Black decided he was going to go out like a mafia soldier, because that's what he'd always been. He got a phone call, and he knew that the meeting that was arranged on it was going to lead to his murder. So Sonny Black gave his keys to his house and his cars to his friend, said all of his goodbyes to his friends and family. He showed up at the meeting, and he was ordered at gunpoint to walk into the basement. He got on his knees, and the mafia don shot him in the head, and yet it didn't kill him. He then picked his bleeding head up from the ground, turned around to the don, and said, "Make the next one count." And he did. Now, these people are considered to be ruthless, and they've created a whole range of torture methods that are still used by criminals to this day. But to try to be honourable and turn up for your own murder is really quite something. Now, if we are talking horrible ways to go, a man who could have survived if only he'd kept his Celtic warriors around him. Celtic warriors? Who could this be? Julius Caesar had recruited Northumbrian Celts to be his special team of security people, his revenue, his ultimate defense against anyone getting at him. He was the Emperor of Rome. He was therefore ordained by God to lead the Holy Roman Empire. And yet one day he said to his retinue of Northumbrian Celts, some of the greatest fighters of their time, he said, "I'm fine, I'm going to meet my friend Brutus. I got nothing to worry about." So he set them down, they went and rested, and as soon as he got free of them, he was stabbed 23 times. Now, it's bad enough that you're stabbed 23 times by various people, but to know that your brother has betrayed you and all of your best friends are sticking the knife in, that has to be a grisly and gruesome way to go. Now, as you know, Stephen Gerrard's doing an amazing job as the manager of Rangers Football Club after an incredible career with Liverpool FC. Well, I'm fairly sure this next guy has absolutely no relationship to him whatsoever, but his name was Balthazar Gerrard. And this guy was arrested, and at his trial, the judge said he was going to be sentenced to be brutally killed. Not just killed, brutally killed. The magistrates decreed that the right hand of him should be burnt off with a red-hot iron, and then the flesh from his bones should be torn from him with pincers in 6 different places. Then he should be quartered, which doesn't mean chopped in 4 bits, it means his stomach opened into 4 pieces, and disemboweled alive, all the innards torn out. Then his heart should be ripped from his chest and slapped across his face, and then finally his head should be hacked off. Now, the torture that he'd had up to that point had been horrifically grisly. On the first night he was arrested, he was hung on a pole and lashed with a whip until you could see his bones. Then his wounds had honey smeared all over them, and a goat was brought in to lick the honey off. Now, goats have got incredibly sharp tongues, and the tongue was pushed into the wounds. However, the goat wouldn't have anything to do with this particular body. So even more torture came his way. He had his hands and feet bound together and he was like a ball, so couldn't sleep at all. Then, every time people went past him, they mocked him, they slapped him, they chucked rubbish at him. And then a weight of 300 pounds, that's 150 kilograms, was attached to each of his big toes for half an hour. This dislocated each and every one of them. And then Gerard was fitted with shoes made of oiled, uncured dog skin. The shoes were 2 fingers shorter than his feet. In this state, he was put in front of a fire where the dog skin contracted, crushing his feet inside them and turning them into stumps. When the shoes were taken off, his feet were just useless. He couldn't use them anymore. They branded under his arms with red-hot irons. Then they put a shirt on him covered in alcohol, and then burning bacon fat was poured all over him, burning the first 2 or 3 layers of his skin. And then just before they executed him, sharp nails were stuck between the flesh and the nails of his hands and feet. Yet, according to historical record, Gerard remained totally calm during his torture, and during his execution said nothing, nor did he scream. What a guy. Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. Let me tell you about Ishikawa Gurman. Now this guy was sentenced to death along with his young son and boiled alive in a huge iron kettle while holding his child above the water. And when he could no longer hold the child up, he plunged his own son under the boiling hot water to kill him as soon as possible. Then, when he had died, he held up his dead and boiled son to show the executioners just what they had done. And then he took a deep breath and put his head under the water and took his own life. Now, another very, very famous guy who actually did an awful lot of good things to help a lot of people, Blackbeard. He ended up getting killed by an ensign on board a ship when they were battling with his crew, and yet it led to a curse over Loch Ness. You can find that story on robsonsworld.com, and a whole host of pirate adventures from all over the world recorded on some of the islands where these things actually happened. Amazing stuff waiting for you there. But it wasn't Blackbeard stabbing. He was fighting a young man at the time who bested him. It was just once he was stabbed and wounded by the young man, other people all wanted a piece of Blackbeard. Other people shot him. He was shot about 5 times. They stabbed him about 100 times before he was fully gone. And then they cut off his head to prove he was dead, and also as a trophy that was hanged on the bowsprit of the boat, and they sailed off so they could show it around and prove that the legend who was Blackbeard was no more. Now, we all watch these films, usually starring Brad Pitt looking hunkier bodily than any of us could. Well, let's go to Sparta. King Aegeus III. He had a major battle against the Macedonians, and he got fatally wounded. Now, rather than get captured by the Macedonians, he said to his men that his men should leave him there. Not help him escape or anything, leave him there on the battlefield so the Macedonians could find him, and rather than chase the rest of his men who were in full retreat, it would give them time to get away from the massive Macedonian army that outnumbered them about 4-1. Now, this king was already fairly close to death. He had half a dozen wounds on his body. But before the Macedonians captured him, despite having his left arm pretty much hacked off, it was hanging on a thread, he managed to kill 9 or 10 Macedonians. Every single one of them rushed at him with a sword, and King Aegeus III bettered them. After all of these people were killed and lay in heaps around him, the Macedonians realized that the best way to get rid of the king was to keep their distance and throw javelins at him. he had about 30 in him by the time they'd finished. Now, if you're a fan of all things to do with witchcraft, I regressed a woman back to a previous life where she was believed to be a witch, and you can hear probably the most scary thing you've ever heard audibly in your life when they kill her in that previous life, and you can hear it. It's an amazing capture. Make sure you check it out. RobsonsWorld.com, of course. But talking of witch trials, one of the victims of the Salem witch trials refused to plead guilty to witchcraft. A lot of people say because he was never a witch. But in an effort to get him to plead guilty, so that it was nice and neat and tidy for the state, they pressed him to death. Now, this meant they put him in between two hard wooden boards and then had boulders placed on top of him until he was literally crushed flat. The last thing that happened, his skull exploding. And of course, he was long dead. According to those people who reported such things, it took Giles Corey 2 days to die, and he only ever said one thing to the people placing weights on the board. More weight. Come on, more weight. Now, this guy was a toughie. Now, I must admit, I absolutely hate drunk drivers and people who hit and run, because they should look after whoever they've clipped, shouldn't they, really? Well, in New York City, a guy called Justin Strezelschik got involved in a hit and run, and the New York police chased his pickup truck 40 miles, and this guy knew he was going to be caught. So he gave the big finger to the troopers chasing him, he threw beer bottles at them, and he decided he was going to go out in that blaze of glory that John Bon Jovi once sang about for the film Young Guns. He decided he was going to crash into a petrol tanker, and he did, head on, at 90 miles an hour. The tanker was carrying corrosive acid, and there was a massive explosion, and Strezelschik didn't make it out alive. Fortunately, the driver escaped with only minor injuries, and nobody knows how that was the case. Now, here on Grisly Tales, we've looked at death in great, great detail. But I tell you, these grisly ways to die, oh my goodness, they get even worse. When the Taisong dynasty in China fell, Bu Tihuan and her family were captured by their enemies. She had to watch her husband and her little 3-year-old daughter being executed in an awful way. She was crushed to death by elephants that the lady had trained herself. However, right to the point of dying, she wasn't scared. She looked into the elephant's eye, made them hesitate, and the elephants turned around and wouldn't do it. The enemies had to set fire to the elephants' tails so that they became angry enough to kill their trainer. Now, there is a very famous legend saying that she wore white silk around her body in order not to be naked, after previous women had died that way. Her heart and liver were eaten by her enemies because they thought that they could become as brave and courageous as she was. Now, we could, if we wanted to, mention Thomas Cook at this point. I've mentioned him before. I've told the story of how he was cannibalized on the island of Hawaii. He was eaten alive. And he was one of those famous explorers, but I'm going to go back to Ferdinand Magellan. In the early 1500s, this Portuguese fella explored all over the place, particularly around the East Indies. And it was there, as soon as the boat left them so that they could go off explorifying, the natives started to attack him, and he was eventually killed, but not before he ended up having a poison arrow to the leg, a spear in his face, a spear through his arm, and 4 hack wounds by machete on his back. To his absolute credit, his crew said that he stayed there to be cut to pieces, to allow his crew to escape alive, and most of them did. Now, we all like our pirates, oh yeah, but we don't know too much about German pirates. Well, there was one called Klaas Stortebeker, a proper German pirate. He was caught eventually after countless adventures and sentenced to death. Now, he offered the city a chain of gold that could reach around the entire city. That was, provided the mayor set his crew free. Stortebeker said it's okay, he would die, he could be executed, but as long as his crew would be all right. Quite gallant. So the mayor promised him that every single member of his crew, all 72 of them, would be set free as soon as he was executed. Stortebeker died, and the mayor beheaded all of the sailors anyway, not sticking to his side of the bargain. And Stortebeker would never know, unless his spirit was still hanging around to be horrified by what the man had done. Sometimes stories can be hyped up. This one you don't really need to. It's the story of a man called Frank Devereaux. His dead body was found in 1883. The body of a 14-foot-high bear was found next to him, and the area around the two bodies was completely trashed. It was assumed that they fought to death with their bare hands, and both ended up dying at the end of it. Now, that could be the truth. It could also possibly be that the bear killed him, played with the body a bit, started to eat him, and choked to death on a bit of gristly flesh. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, I know we could have a week talking about grisly stories about dentists. They're not our favourite people, especially in recent times when we haven't even been able to get in to see them. However, there was a dentist in the United States Army called Bell Salomon, and he was killed on the island of Saipan in 1944. The Japanese overran the village that he was based in, and he provided covering fire to give time for the evacuation of the wounded from his medical tent. His body was eventually found with a samurai sword through it. He was slumped over a machine gun with a pile of 78 dead Japanese infantrymen directly in front of him. That's a hero right there. Ben Cochran, there's a story. He was a trapper, and he worked in Canada, Manitoba, in 1922. He was alone by a river when he saw hundreds of massive timber wolves coming at him from all sides. He knew that he couldn't escape. The only chance he had was his rifle, but he only had half a dozen bullets with him. So he fired them at the wolves, failing to scare them away. So he fired again. He killed about 7 of them before his last bullet was gone. But he didn't stop there. When the wolves came closer and pounced on him, he turned the gun around and beat them with the rifle stock, pounding against their heads. He killed 4 more before his weapon smashed into bits against their skulls, and the rest of the wolves took him and ate him, ripping his body into shreds. The newspaper of the day said, "All that remained to tell of this grim Northland tragedy were the trapper's bones." But the bones of 11 huge timber wolves were also found close to the spot where he'd been attacked. This man knew he was going down, but he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Now, time for a story of a good Catholic priest. Maybe about time. The man's called Maximilian Kolbe. He was a Catholic priest who was sent to Auschwitz because he sheltered escaping Jews. One of the prisoners from the camps had escaped, so 10 others were selected to starve to death in a hollow concrete cube. One of the people there, one of the Jewish people, shouted out that he had a wife and children, so he asked not to be put into the cube to die. So the priest, Maximilian Kolbe, stepped forward and took his place. When he and 3 of the others were still alive, after the other 6 had died, this was 2 weeks later with no food or water, Kolbe was injected with carbolic acid, and when it came to be his turn to be injected, he handed his arm over without any kind of struggle at all and met his maker. I think it's time I gave you a proper war hero, the real deal. James W. Robinson was given the posthumous Medal of Honor. Why? He knew he was going to be killed by the enemy, so he decided that he would race forward and destroy an enemy machine gun nest to make it easier for the people behind him. Despite incredible amounts of fire in his direction, he ran straight into it, taking several bullets in his chest. He was also set on fire by tracer ammunition, and while he was on fire, he charged into a machine gun nest and killed 7 men that were manning it before dying himself. And also, you never know whether stories told by Christians are true or not. So you can take this with a pinch of salt. It's the last one I've got for you for the moment. Saint Lawrence of Rome was arrested by the Romans for spreading this made-up religion called Christianity, and that's how they named it at the time. And they decided the Romans would be entertained by the death of this fella, so they put him on a giant rotisserie grill, and he was executed by roasting. Now, according to the Christians, they say his last words were, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." But to me that sounds like some gag that somebody thought was funny in about 1912, and it remains told to this day. All we can be sure of was the guy died in a nasty, nasty way. Let's get on to some more grisly tales. Now, we're all fans of all the Jurassic Park movies. We're quite into dinosaurs in general. So when it comes to prehistory, quite like to find out anything to do with our part of the world. Well, up in Scotland, the small coastal town of Irvine is probably one of Scotland's earliest ancient settlements. It dates well back into prehistory, long before the Mesolithic. In fact, part of the city, Dreghorn, has the oldest continually occupied inhabited village in all of Europe. Thousands of Mesolithic artifacts and some Paleolithic artifacts dating back as far as 2.5 million years ago. Now, some people think we've only been on the planet 7,000 years. Some religions, including Judaism, believe it's a lot less than that, and yet here is proof that there were human beings on Earth 2.5 million years ago. Now, if you realise that the whole Jesus thing was only the last 2,000 years, and you take 2,000 years off 2.5 million years, let's be serious about it. Is it really conceivable that God would leave it 2.5 million years before he would make any impact on the thing that he'd created? Yeah, that's what I thought. Some faith systems still refuse to believe that humans have been on Earth longer than 2, 3, 5, 7,000 years max, yet they've got proof of it. They have checked them out. They have dated them, early stone tools used by man 2,398,000 years BC. All of this area you find Iron Age forts built on top of areas used for millennia by different tribes, different historical dates of man. Yet it's the granny stone that has caused consternation over the years. Yes, you could argue, what's a granny stone? Is it something in our kegs? No, leave it alone, walk away. It's described as Irvin's prehistoric puzzle because people are not really sure what it is. More particularly, they've got no idea where it came from. Scientists have had numerous ideas as to how it got there. It's right in the middle of the river of Irvine. Some say it rolled down from the mountains in a glacier during the Ice Age. Others declare it was the last ancient standing stone from a huge stone circle. The others say maybe it was removed by blasting, but they're all at best rough guesses. So I looked back through the ancient pagan histories, and I found a couple of stories that could fit. In the Mesolithic period, when it was very busy in and around the Irvine area, there was a story that's called The Day the Moon Came Down. Now, it was a time when the moon appeared very large in the sky, and some locals back then were very afraid, believing that it was so close it was going to hit the earth. And in the early hours of the morning there was a huge fiery ball that exploded through the heavens and crashed into a lake where the Irvine Weir currently stands. Once again, many of the superstitious locals believed they had somehow offended the moon, so it had smitten the planet. Some pregnant cattle miscarried. Some people raced up the hills to hide, but not one person could explain the huge rock that was protruding from the water. It seemed to be sizzling and steaming, and the usually chilly water was strangely, comfortably warm. Up to 200 people bathed in the water in that hour, as something had pulled something blazing hot from the sky. Now, some 400 years before that, a ball of light was said to have landed on a nearby hilltop. They claim, ancient legend, that people from the stars had met and befriended locals, taking some of them with them and leaving 4 of their own kind to live with them on Earth. Then the fiery craft left, promising to return to watch over the people. So because of that, some thought they must have angered these sky travellers and they had fired some kind of weapon, a missile maybe, at them. But there's another story that we believe gave the stone its name, the Granny Stone, the Granny Stone. In the late Mesolithic, a village elder known as Ganny Gee led her tribe in a battle against 3 other tribes that were united against them. Now, despite being outnumbered almost 10 to 1, the women of the village, covered in woad, a blue dye, and bare-breasted, fought alongside their men and snatched an unlikely victory. At that time, the stone was right in the centre of the river, and it had walkways leading to it. On top of that stone, Ganny Gee stood and declared peace, freeing all of the other tribesfolk, provided they remained loyal to her. They stayed loyal to her, and they stayed loyal to her tribe, and it led to almost 400 years of peace. We've had a bit of all sorts tonight, so let me tell you a nice tale from the wearers of the green, the Irish, and the scapegoats of Ardagina House. Now, in Ardmore, County Waterford, there's a fine arrangement of towers and battlements locally known as Ardo House or McKenna Castle. This beautiful grouping of buildings oozes 14th and 15th century splendour, and it has an incomparable history for people literally getting away with murder. The early owners, James Fitzgerald and his wife Ardagina, were said to be inseparable, had it not been for the appearance of a young, super handsome young man called Robert Coston. To James Fitzgerald's surprise, his name had been added to the title of the property by his wife, without him knowing. So Fitzgerald, without admitting to his wife that he knew her game, presumably to poison him and live with a young stud, decided to act. He charged Coston with the theft of a golden cup, an expensive family heirloom. Coston, realising the jig was up, legged it and hid in a sea cave whilst wondering what to do. But Fitzgerald's hunting dogs found him, chewed him up a bit, and then Fitzgerald's men dragged him back to the castle. The following morning, he was hanged. They say it took him 3 falls to die, and on the 3rd occasion he was still not choking. So his sweetheart, Helen Fitzgerald, ordered a servant to leap up onto his swinging body to break his neck and finish him off. This way, she would never have to answer her crime of infidelity. The very next scapegoat was another castle owner, Sir Francis Prendergast, who many believe was a psychotic murderer. Occasionally, staff would find a bucket of warm blood in his room, or a bloody pool in the corridor. Prendergast always had an excuse. He was bleeding some grouse and pheasants, or he'd smeared the floor with a boar that he'd stuck that very morning. Yet after he died in the late 1700s, the subsequent occupier found the body of a servant that Prendergast had hanged for fun under the dining room floor. According to legend, a girl visited the castle to introduce Prendergast to his baby son. Prendergast ordered the castle cleared except for his 2 most trusted henchmen. On everybody's return to the castle, the girl and child had gone. Most of them presumed he'd bought them off, like many wealthy men did. Yet later they would find the body of a child buried under steps leading onto one of the towers. If that was his illegitimate heir, the girl's body is also hidden somewhere in the castle too. It's thought that he killed dozens of people, as many went missing after visiting the castle during his tenure, and yet he would never be charged with any crime. This illustrious property has even more dark stories, including the story of a man called Richard Ord, who was arrested and dragged to the castle. Now, this was at a time when it was owned by the Coughlan's. In about 1796, Anna, Madame Coughlin, had been married to the 8th Earl of Barrymore, who was a confidant to the Prince of Wales. However, he still managed to die in debt, leaving his family to make do any way they could. So Widow Coughlin had fallen onto evil times and had hired a group of smugglers, and whilst smuggling, a local magistrate heard of this kind of activity, so was determined to root out the perpetrators. Widow Coughlin heard this, so told him that she knew who it was. She really did. It just happened to be her neighbour, Richard Ord, a man who coincidentally owned land that she wanted right next to her castle. Ord got wind of this and rode off on his best charger, whilst eating half a chicken he'd grabbed before his escape. Well, just outside the castle, he began choking on a chicken bone, falling onto the rocky roadway and smashing his skull to pieces. So, the magistrate claimed all of his money, threw his family out onto the streets, and gave his stables and pasture land to Widow Coughlin for her assistance. Now, Widow Coughlin had 2 daughters and 2 handicapped children. One daughter became Lady Barrymore, and her sister Eliza came to live with her in London, where she met the French Duc de Castries. She married him and returned to France with him after the French Revolution. Yet the fates of the 2 handicapped boys is not quite so certain. Many believe that the widow had a hand in their deaths. The elder boy used to enjoy being pushed onto his white horse, and he would tie himself on and race around the estate. Well, long after he died, people said that if they ever spotted Jeremiah Coughlin, they themselves would die within the year. 27 people claimed to have seen him within the next 10 years, and each one died before the year was out. So enough to chew on, yet there is a final twist in the tale. Joseph Emmanuel lived at the castle from around 1907 up until 1913. And after that, the castle accepted the injured Irish soldiers that were fighting in World War I. And Emmanuel, who visited the place right the way up to 1920, claimed that the spirits of the dead had filled the castle, and he left, never to return, abandoning it. Now, I must admit, I don't know whether you're married or whether you're unmarried, but if you are married or you've ever been married, I hope that your honeymoon was a good one. I hope that you gave or received a fine seeing to and have happy memories of it. Whether things went wonky after that, at least you got something to cling on to. And hopefully you were fair with your settlements. But I'm going to tell you a story of some of the worst honeymoons ever. Now, back in 1903, George Crossman married a woman called Ellen Sampson. They were married, and the morning after their wedding night, they had an argument, and Crossman killed his bride by smashing her head in with a masonry hammer. He hid the body in a tin box in an upstairs room at their home in London, and it stayed there for the next 15 months, holding in all the bodily juices that had now fermented and started drying up, mummifying the woman. And for most of the time that she was in that tin box, he was living with another woman called Edith Thompson. Eventually, the lodger who had the room below where the box was, a guy called William Dell, complained about an awful smell seeping into his room. When the police came in to investigate, Crossman was out. He returned to find the police there, and before they could apprehend him, he slit his own throat with a cut-throat razor. Also, Cesare Borgia. A lot of people have heard of the Borgias, a very famous Italian family. Well, Cesare was the son of Pope Alexander V, and his wedding night was ruined when a practical joker switched his regular medication, which was for chest problems, for a huge bottle of laxative pills. Apparently, he pooed all over his bride, and he kept pooing all night long. It took him 3 days for his stomach to recover. In Minnesota, a newlywed called Greg McLeod broke his back trying to carry his 20-stone bride Helen over the threshold. When the doctors laid him out, the coroner declared that the groom's injuries, remember he was only 10 stone, was consistent with those of somebody who'd been hit by a car travelling at 50 miles an hour. Let's have a German wedding now. Amy Weltz. She was married in Brisbane, in Australia in 1993, and she didn't realise that it was a tradition in Australia to smear wedding cake in the face of your partner. Everybody did it. But she didn't know. And when her brand new husband, Charlie, rubbed a slice of wedding cake in her face while she was wearing the dress that had cost her an arm and a leg, she responded by picking up a huge champagne bottle and smacking him over the head, killing him dead instantly. Now, a very famous Victorian writer and critic was called John Ruskin. And on his wedding night, he found the sight of his brand new wife's pubic hair so shocking that he vowed there and then never to sleep with her again. And he didn't. She was too bushy for him. King George, there you go, King George IV. He found himself in a similar kind of predicament, really. King George IV fainted when he first saw his obese, stinky, sweaty and ugly wife, Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, the day before they were due to get married. So on his wedding night, because he still had to marry her, it was an organised and arranged marriage, he got himself so stot and drunk so that he could tolerate the nastiness of this woman long enough to have sex with her once. After that, the couple went their separate ways. They never tried to hide the fact that they loathed each other. And then, when Napoleon Bonaparte died in 1821, a messenger rushed to tell the king, "Your Majesty, your greatest enemy is dead." King George IV apparently replied, "Is she, by God?" thinking it was actually Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Off to Japan now, where a young Japanese couple called Sachi and Tomio Hidachi got married in 1978. Problem was, they were pretty shy. Didn't want each other to see their bits and bobs. So they didn't get around to consummating their marriage for 14 years. And sadly, the excitement of enjoying normal marital relations for the first time was too much for them. They both had a heart attack and they both died in the middle of it. Now, those of you who are into all royal related things might have heard of the royal biographer Andrew Morton. Well, as a special honeymoon treat, Prince Charles allowed Diana, Princess Diana, to lie in the Balmoral heather while he read her passages from the works of Carl Jung and Lauren van der Post. I bet that lass was thrilled. She obviously would have prepared a little bit of drum and bass. Wonder if he did the same thing for Camilla. There's a thing. Now, in 1983, Moses Alexander, a 93-year-old, got married to Frances Tompkins. She was an older woman, of course. She was 105. They got married in New York. The following morning, the newlyweds were removed, both dead, from their marital bed. Okay, let's get to John Harvey Kellogg. Now, this is the man that invented all those breakfast cereals, Kellogg's, all the cereals, all the cornflakes. On his wedding night with a woman called Ella Eaton, he spent all night writing plain facts for the old and young, 644 pages, all about the evils of sexual intercourse. This included an essay called Secret Vice, Solitary Vice or Self-Abuse, Its Symptoms and Results. He was obsessed that masturbation would actually end up killing people. Hell's teeth, don't know how much he did it. The 39 telltale signs that someone is a masturbator. This included things like sleeplessness, a love of being alone, unnatural boldness, a confusion of ideas, the use of tobacco, the use of strong drink, and also acne. The marriage with him and Ella was never consummated. Therefore, he didn't end up with a son or daughter and heir. And that is our Grisly Tale selection for this week, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Hell's teeth, we've learned a lot about all kinds, haven't we? As usual. If you can, tip a wink to robsonsworld.com, that would be fabulous. If you're in need of a book to show you where to see ghosts and spirits in the northern part of Britain, Grisly Tales from Northumbria is still available on Amazon and through Northern Heritage Publishers. If you want a copy of that, that's cool. Be great and it would help me out. There are many new things coming in the near future. Make sure you keep your eyes and ears open for all of them. And until you and I are back together again, thanks for your company. From me, Alan Robson. God bless you, and I wish you well.